Do not say head coverings are a small matter. They are a mega matter.
We have a certain dress code, not just for women, but for men also. We have things that we are expected to wear, not to wear.
Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. What? What does that mean?
But this passage is so obscure, we really don't know.
The early Christians are our strongest evidence, by far, that as Anabaptists, we are interpreting the New Testament correctly. We haven't just invented anything. We are teaching what they taught in the beginning.
And it's very clear from these works of art that it was not scandalous to a Greek woman or a Roman woman to appear without a veil.
We had discovered that we were wrong about a lot of things in the Bible, and what we were taught didn't match up with history, didn't match up with the early church.
In fact, the more I read and studied early Christianity, the more evidence I saw that these were just, in fact, absurd explanations, totally fictitious. None of them cited any historical evidence to back up what they were saying.
The Iranian leadership are completely insane. I don't even think they allow women to drive over there, force them to wear burqas everywhere.
We want it where the women over there don't have to wear the you-know-what. Then I saw a women interview. They said, we want to wear them. We've worn them for 1,000 years. Why would anybody tell us not to? They want to. What the hell are we getting involved for? In fact, it's easier. You don't have to put up makeup. Look how beautiful everyone looks. Wouldn't it be easier? Wah. Right? Wouldn't that be easy? I'll tell you, if I was a woman, I don't want to. Wah. I'm ready, darling. Let's go. It's true.
It forced me to search and search and search the scriptures and history to see what was truth.
In short, the early Christians practiced exactly what 1 Corinthians 11 says.
What kind of veil does God command women to wear? About 10 years ago, I started reading the Church Fathers in depth with my friends. We had all committed ourselves to listen to the early church. And one of the things we noticed after a few years of studying is that the early church had a completely different concept of not only veiling, but just female modesty in general. And so what you're about to see is the culmination of our research on this subject. And although we did release a video on this subject a couple of years ago, this video is going to be a little less scripted because there are so many little nitty-gritty details to talk about here, and I think a lot of them are best addressed in a more live recording. We tend to get our conception of biblical dress from movies and illustrated Bible books that we read as a kid, but we won't see the ancient standard of female modesty portrayed in movies and illustrated Bibles, because the people who make these visual depictions of women in ancient times are actually ignorant of history. This is actually one of your greatest obstacles to accepting the veil. It's overcoming your preconceived notion of how women looked throughout history, which has been influenced by modern imagination. But we came to our conclusion about what kind of veil Paul is talking about after we read all of the Church Fathers saying it's a complete veil covering the whole body, including the face. And before we're accused of being rigorous, we just want to mention that the veiling of women's faces in public, while it does appear to be a rigorous position, is actually just a bare minimum requirement. We're going to prove that. An extreme version of veiling would be to require our wives and our daughters to veil even at home and around their immediate family members. And there were some women who did these things in ancient times. Virgins like Saint Mary would shut themselves up in their houses for most of their lives, coming out only on rare occasions. But the early church never required these things of all women, nor do we. There is such a thing as being extreme on this issue, but that is not us. One thing that we have to address before we get into all the evidence is we must address the real obstacle that's facing just about everybody who is about to hear us out on this issue, and that is the emotional obstacle. Believe it or not, your biggest challenge here is not receiving an adequate amount of evidence to convince you of this intellectually. The biggest obstacle is actually the emotional one. Your main obstacle is actually your own emotional bias against the doctrine. No matter how convincing this evidence is, it'll still be extremely difficult for you to accept it on a purely emotional basis. And so before you start watching this series, I encourage you to examine yourself and ask yourself, would I actually practice this form of modesty if I received the necessary evidence to convince me? And you should actually ask yourself what would convince you of this. And don't be vague about it, because there's nothing more foolish than to sit and listen to all this evidence that we're going to present to you, and then by the end of it to say, well, no amount of evidence would convince me, I've already made up my mind, and realize that Christ already warned you that you would have to make sacrifices. In fact, he said we have to be willing to die. We have to be willing to take up our cross and follow him, and even be willing to be tortured to death as he was for the sake of eternal life. And realize that wearing a veil is actually not the end of the world. The worst part about it, the most uncomfortable part about it, is that your family and your friends are going to think you're kind of weird. But the question is, are you willing to look weird in the world's eyes for the sake of obeying God's commandments? And I would expect that anybody watching this video is at least somewhat familiar with the scripture that we're going to be discussing today. It comes from 1 Corinthians 11. Here's the passage as it appears in most translations. And after we read it, I'm going to give you a simplified explanation of each verse and what Paul means in each of these verses. But first I'll read the more clunky and archaic way that it's translated in modern Bibles. Paul says, "But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with his head veiled dishonors his head, but any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled dishonors her head. It is the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman will not cover herself, then she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut short or shaved, let her cover herself. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. For this reason, a woman is indebted to have a veil, or authority, on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that for a man to have long hair is a shame to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her as a covering. But if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God." Now I want you guys to understand, this passage actually is very easy to understand, but you do need a little bit of context. If you have the context, you will understand it perfectly. So I'm going to give you a simplified version of what Paul is saying here, and I promise you I'm not dumbing it down to the point of removing the actual meaning. I have gotten this simplified contextual reading from reading the Church Fathers, because they add context to what Paul is saying. So Paul says, "Do what I do. I'm imitating Christ. You do the same. I'll give you credit for this much. You haven't forgotten me, and you're sticking to the traditions I taught you, but you need to get this straight. Every man answers to his head, which is Christ. Every woman answers to her head, which is man, and Christ himself answers to his head, which is God. If a man prays or speaks for God with his head veiled like a woman, he humiliates himself. And if a woman prays or speaks for God with her veil taken off, she disgraces herself too. She might as well have her head shaved bald. It's the same thing. If a woman won't veil her head, then let her go all the way and shave her hair off. But if it's such a disgrace for her to be shaved or have her hair cut short, then she better wear her veil. A man should never hide his head with a veil, because he's the image and glory of God. But the woman is supposed to bring glory to the man. The man didn't come from the woman came from the man. The man wasn't created for the woman's sake. The woman was created for the man's sake. This is the reason why women are indebted to wear a veil, because of the incident involving the angels who lusted after women. In the Lord's sight, woman isn't independent of man, and man isn't independent of woman. Just as the woman came from the man, now the man is born through the woman, and everything ultimately comes from God. Use common sense. Do you really think it's appropriate for a woman to pray to God with her veil stripped off? Doesn't your natural instinct tell you that if a man wears his hair long, it's disgraceful to him, but if a woman wears her hair long, it's glorious to her? That's because her hair was given to her as a natural veil to wrap around her head. In the end, if anyone wants to fight about this, we don't have your strange Greek custom, and neither do all of God's other churches. Hopefully that helps you understand what's actually going on here. You see, Paul is not establishing a new custom. Paul is enforcing an old custom. Paul is not telling women to put on a special cloth at the time of prayer. Paul is actually commanding women not to take off their existing veils during prayer. And Paul is not telling women to cover their hair. Paul is telling women to cover their entire heads, including the face. But we know some people will object, people who are not really familiar with the passage, and they might suggest that this is actually talking about some temporary custom, and that Paul is only enforcing some law that they might have had in a culture a long time ago, but that it's not something God requires of women today in every culture. But we would just point out 5 reasons why Paul is actually giving a permanent law and why it is obvious this law can never be set aside in the future. The first reason is that Paul says woman was made from man. So that's talking about subjection in origin. Number 2 is woman was made for man. That's subjection in purpose. Number 3 is, he says, she ought to wear a veil because of the angels. So that's talking about the beauty of women, which the angels lusted after and which must be obscured. Number 4 is, he says, she should wear a veil because nature itself teaches you. That's referencing a worldwide custom. And number 5 is, he says, all the churches veil their women. So this is now referring to the early church's practice. These 5 reasons prove that this is not a temporary law, nor a law that only applies to certain regions of the earth. This is talking about nature itself, God's created order for man and woman. And you can also see that Paul is encouraging us to look at what the early church's practice was. If you have any doubt about what the right practice is, you ought to be referencing the early church's practice. So the big question is, did Paul have a face veil in mind? And everybody wants to see what the evidence for this is. And you're going to be overwhelmed when you see what it is. There are a few clues that will help inform us of what kind of veil Paul was thinking of when he told the women that they should be wearing a veil. The first one is, we know that Paul was an observant Jew, so we could try looking at the Old Testament to see how women veiled back then. And we also know Paul used to be a Pharisee, so we could look at what Jewish tradition says about veiling in contemporary sources like Philo, Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Talmud. We could also look at the early church's teachings. That is a no-brainer. We could also look at what the early church says is the practice of the whole world, since Paul appeals to natural custom. He says, do what's natural. He says, judge for yourselves. That's why I would suggest we ought to verify what the rest of the world was practicing at the time of Paul writing 1 Corinthians 11. And the fifth clue is that since Paul is writing to Greeks in the Greek language, we could go focus on Greek history to see how they defined the veil. After all, Paul is using a Greek word, so why don't we find out how the Greeks defined a veil? He didn't include a definition of what a veil is in his letter. So I think we can use the Greeks' definition of a veil and rely on that, since Paul felt comfortable using Greek words to describe the kind of veil he wanted women to wear. Now, there are a lot of reasons why you can be sure it is a face veil, but we can't get into all those reasons right now, so we're only going to go over 15 of them. Number 1 is that the Greek word for veil means completely hidden. Number 2 is that all righteous women in the Old Testament veiled their faces. Number 3 is that Jewish tradition required women to veil their faces. Number 4 is that all of the early church fathers agreed it's a face veil. Number 5 is that even heretical sects like the Gnostics strictly required the face veil. Number 6 is Greek and Roman women in Paul's time veiled their faces. Number 7, Paul appealed to nature, that is the worldwide custom of veiling. Number 8, virtually all Protestants from the 1500s to the 1900s understood it to be a face veil. Even if they weren't practicing it themselves, they were aware Paul was talking about a face veil, and they write that down. I'm going to show you. Number 9 is Paul instructs women to be shamefaced. We're going to see that when somebody's shamefaced, that means they're veiling their entire head, including the face. And number 10 is Greek men used to veil their faces at prayer time, which is what Paul is forbidding them to do. That is the weird custom that he is telling them the other churches do not share. Number 11 is long hair serves as a natural face veil for women. And we're going to show the church fathers forbidding men to have long hair, specifically because it gets in their eyes. Number 12 is the exchange of clothes is an abomination. That is referring to a veil. We're going to prove that. Number 13 is woman is described as the glory of man, and we know that Moses veiled his glory. Isn't that interesting? Paul writes 1 Corinthians 11. He talks about veiling. He says woman is the glory of man. He says she should be veiled. And then he writes another letter to the Corinthians talking about Moses receiving God's glory, shining very brightly, and his glory being dangerous to the Israelites to look at, and then he veils the glory. I wonder if there could be a connection to women needing to be covered up since they are the glory of man. And number 14 is women are indebted to veil their beauty because of the angels. We're going to prove that this is a modesty issue. This is about covering up your beauty. And of course, the face is the most beautiful part of a woman. And number 15, husband and wife symbolize Christ and his church. And guess what? Christ's church is veiled. We're going to prove that from the example of all the righteous wives of the patriarchs in the Old Testament. They're all wearing face veils. And we're going to show that even the tabernacle, which symbolizes Christ's bride, his church, it has a face veil. So these 15 reasons are the ones we're going to be focusing on in this series. But I already know what a lot of people are thinking when they're watching this, and it's just so sad we have to go over something like this. But there really are people out there who will ask the question, how could anybody lust after a woman's face? But before I appeal to what ought to be common sense, I just want to point out that the scriptures talk about the beauty of women's faces frequently. For instance, in the book, which is dedicated to the subject of a man being in love with his wife, he spends a lot of time talking about how beautiful the features of her face are. He says, "Behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. Your eyes are doves behind your veil." He says, "Your lips are like scarlet thread. Your mouth is lovely. Your temples are like a piece of a pomegranate behind your veil." And we know that he's married to her, so he's obviously seen her unveiled. But he goes on and on about her head and her neck. He says, "Your neck is like an ivory tower. Your eyes are like pools in Heshbon. Your nose is like a tower of Lebanon," etc., etc. In the Proverbs, we're instructed to be careful about the beauty of a woman's face. Solomon says to us, "Do not let desire for her beauty take you, nor be caught by your eyes, nor let her capture you with her eyelids." Judith goes to destroy Holofernes in the book of Judith, and in the book she beautifies herself and puts on makeup. It says she was beautiful in appearance and had a very lovely face. And it says she put sandals on her feet and put on her anklets and bracelets and rings and her earrings and all her ornaments and made herself very beautiful to entice the eyes of all men who might see her. We know Judith was a righteous woman, of course, but she did this in order to entice an evil man, the general of the Babylonian army, and she intended to kill him, which she did end up doing. It says, when Judith came into the presence of Holofernes and his servants, they all marveled at the beauty of what? Her face. And then after she slaughters Holofernes in his tent, she says to the Israelites, "But I swear by the life of the Lord who protected me in the way that I walked, that it was my face that seduced him to his destruction." And again, how many times do the scriptures say that harlots especially will beautify their faces and they will wear makeup? What do they spend all that time beautifying, by the way? Is it their arms? Is it their legs? Is it their neck? No, it's the face. Read all these examples of Tamar seducing Judah, or in 2 Kings it says, when Jehu came to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head. And in Jeremiah, God says, "And you, O desolate one, what do you mean that you dress in scarlet, that you deck yourself with ornaments of gold, that you enlarge your eyes with paint? In vain you beautify yourself. Your lovers despise you." And when he says your lovers, of course, he's calling her a harlot. Again, God says to the harlot Israel, he says, "And lo, they came, for whom you washed yourself, painted your eyes, and decked yourself with ornaments." And then later on he says, "Yet they went in unto her as they go in unto a woman that plays the harlot." And so we, of course, reject this ridiculous objection that we might hear a person saying where they say, "Oh, well, how can the face cause a man to lust?" I mean, who do you think you're kidding? When you spend hundreds or even thousands of dollars on makeup, when you spend hours in the bathroom beautifying your face, what do you spend the most time beautifying? It is your face. So you're not fooling anybody. The face does cause men to stumble. The scriptures testify to that fact, and also common sense testifies to it. So the question is, does God really expect women to veil the face? And we're going to give 15 reasons why you can know that for sure. The first reason is that the Greek word that Paul uses for veil, it means completely hidden. This Greek word occurs in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, about 300 times. So that makes it much easier to understand what Paul means when he says a woman should be covered. And you can look up any Greek lexicon, they will all give the same definition of this word, kalypto. The definition is to cover, to hide, to veil, or to conceal. I think everybody already innately knows this, that when you hear the word veil, you know that it is hiding something. You've probably heard people talk about an unveiling ceremony, where something that used to be invisible becomes visible. Something that was hidden suddenly gets put on display. This word is actually the same word that's used for the apocalypse. You know how the book of Revelation is sometimes called the apocalypse of John? That comes from that Greek word kalypto. And the word apocalypse comes from two different words, apo and kalypto. It just means to take away the veil, to take away the covering. And so they translate that as revelation, to show what was previously hidden. Again, this word occurs many times in the Old Testament. In Genesis, it says, "The waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth. All the high mountains that were under the whole sky were covered." Again, it says, "The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered." Again, the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, and let the water restore and cover the Egyptians." It's that word, kalypto. In the Proverbs, Solomon says, "He who conceals his sins does not prosper." So I would just ask you, viewer, what does it mean to conceal your sins? It obviously means to hide them. Do you see how this word is being used? Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it on both their shoulders, went in backwards, and covered the nakedness of their father. So again, I would ask, was any part of Noah's nakedness still visible when that happened? No, it was covered. God says, "I will bring forth many locusts over all your borders, and they shall cover the surface of the earth so that one won't be able to see the earth." Well, that's a lot of locusts. When he says they're going to cover, that's the word kalypto, they're going to cover the surface of the earth so that one won't be able to see the earth, he obviously means the sheer number of locusts is going to render the surface of the earth invisible. You won't be able to see it. Again, in Numbers, "So they and all that were related to them went down alive into Hades, and the earth closed on them." Again, it's that word kalypto. I would just ask, was Korah and the other rebels, were they visible after the earth closed on them? No. Again, this is in the book of Numbers, when Balaam and Balak are watching the Israelites come into their land. They say, "Behold, this people has come out of Egypt, and behold, it covers the whole view of the land." So they're saying the sheer number of people on the earth is covering the ground. They are numerous. They're like a blanket spread over the earth. Then again, Ahab came into his house sullen and angry. He laid himself down on his bed and covered his face. Again, a drunken woman causes great wrath. She will not cover her own shame. Blessed are those whose infringements are forgiven and whose sins are covered over. I would just ask, when the scriptures say that your sins are covered, does it mean that your sins are still visible? Again, "Though you have crushed us in the haunt of jackals and covered us with the shadow of death." His blessing covered the dry land. Your influence covered the earth. Let us lie down in our shame and let our disgrace cover us. If a man opens a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, when I shall extinguish you, I will cover the heavens and make its stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. And obviously the reason why the moon is not going to give its light is because the sun is completely covered. Again, in Daniel, he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and hidden." You see how the translators just translate it as hidden sometimes when that word katakalypto is in there? Same word Paul is using for a woman's covering. It was so when Elijah heard it that he hid his face in his sheepskin. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "I will disguise myself." So it's the same word, katakalypto. "I will disguise myself and go into the battle, but you put on your robes." So the king of Israel disguised himself, and they went into the battle. So I would just ask, do you guys believe that Paul said that women should disguise themselves? Do you realize it's the same word that they're translating as disguise or hidden? Again, in Sirach, "A man who goes astray from his own marriage bed says in his heart, 'Who sees me? Darkness is around me, and the walls hide me. No one sees me.'" So is that man visible or invisible? Now we're going to go to the New Testament using this same word. "Suddenly a violent storm arose on the sea, so that the boat was being covered by the waves." You got to imagine these huge waves going on the boat and just covering the whole boat. These aren't tiny little waves, guys. Jesus says, "Therefore do not be afraid of them, for there is nothing covered that will not be uncovered, and hidden that will not be made known." Are you guys seeing how this word is used? "For there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, nor hidden that will not be known." Jesus says, "No one, after lighting a lamp, covers it with a container or puts it under a bed, but places it on a lampstand so that those who come in may see the light." Do you see how if something is kalypto, then it's invisible? Again, Jesus says, "Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.'" And in Revelation, it describes the same scene where the people are saying, "Fall on us and hide us." And again, it says in Matthew and in Mark, "And some began to spit on him and to cover his face. But they did not understand this saying, and it was hidden from them, so that they did not perceive it." That's the word, kalypto. In James, he says, "He should know that the one who brings a sinner back from the error of his way will save that person's soul from death and cover a multitude of sins." And Peter says the same thing, "Above all, maintain a fervent love among yourselves, for love covers a multitude of sins." Guys, does God still see those sins if they're covered? Therefore, having such a hope, we use great boldness in our speech and are not like Moses, who used to put a veil over his face. For until this very day, at the reading of the Old Testament, the same veil remains unlifted. He says there is a veil over their heart. Again, guys, this veil prevents them from seeing. It's something that completely obscures its object. And Paul says again, "But even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled only to those who are perishing." Again, talking about the gospel being hidden from certain people so that they cannot understand it. And now let's look at some examples in the Old Testament where the opposite version of the word is used, the word for unveiling or uncovering something. It says, David returned to bless his household, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How glorious the king of Israel was today, who uncovered himself today in the eyes of the handmaids of his servants, as one of the vain fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." You see how this word is associated with decency? Like you're not supposed to uncover yourself. You're not supposed to make yourself naked. It says, "Then the channels of the sea appeared." That's the word. They were revealed. "The foundations of the world were laid bare." Nicanor found out that his plan was discovered. It's the same word, apocalypse. "Then God uncovered the eyes of Balaam, and he saw." You see how he couldn't see before his eyes were uncovered? "In you have they uncovered their father's nakedness. These uncovered her nakedness. Noah removed the covering of the ship and looked." See, guys, he wasn't able to look before he removed the covering of the ship. "He reveals the deep and secret things. He who reveals secrets destroys trust." Do you guys see how if something is kalyptoed, it is secret. It's hidden. It's not known. Again, Sirach says, "He declares the things that are past and the things that shall be, and reveals the traces of hidden things." Again, in the scriptures, it talks about buttocks being uncovered. This is talking about decency. Something that was hidden is now revealed. Again, in Isaiah, "But the Lord will expose its face and scatter the ones dwelling in it." Your shamefacedness will be discovered. That's the word unveiled. "For the greatness of your iniquity are your skirts uncovered. But I have made Esau bare, I have uncovered its secret places, and he shall not be able to hide himself." Again, we're going to go over a few more. And please do not be annoyed at how many verses we're going over here. We're trying to establish something in opposition to the whole world right now. Nobody accepts this doctrine today. Nobody understands the meaning of these words. So we are un-brainwashing you and re-establishing in your minds the true definition of this word, kalypto. So now we're going to see some more instances of this word for unveiled being used in the New Testament. It says, "At that time Jesus answered, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you hid these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to infants." Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you." Again, guys, that was hidden from all the other people, but it became known to Peter. It was apocalypsed. Jesus says, "It will be the same way in the day that the Son of Man is revealed." And Paul in 1 Corinthians says, "The work of each will become visible, for the day will make it plain, because it is revealed in fire." Again, Jesus says, "No one knows the Son except the Father, neither does anyone know the Father except the Son, and he to whom the Son desires to reveal him." But here's the real kicker, guys. Paul doesn't just say that a woman should be kalypto. Paul uses the word katakalypto, a verb that means to be completely hidden. You see, kata means coming down. And as we're going to prove, it doesn't just mean coming down a little bit. It means coming down to the bottom. It means coming down to the floor. So when Paul says a woman should be katakalypto, he is saying she should be covered from head to toe. Paul couldn't have used a more extreme word to describe face veiling. There is nothing more extreme in the entire Greek language. We know this is what Paul means because this word occurs frequently in the Old Testament. So the example that we're going to go over first, wherein this word katakalypto occurs in the Old Testament, is in regard to the Ark of the Covenant. Some of you may remember in the scriptures, God says that the sons of Aaron are to cover up the Ark of the Covenant whenever the camp of Israel sets out. And we all know whenever people make illustrations of the Ark of the Covenant being katakalypto, they always make it completely hidden. At least they should. If they're not making it completely hidden, they're completely missing the point. But again, this is a no-brainer. This is a given. People know that katakalypto, in regard to the Ark of the Covenant, means totally hidden. This is Numbers 4:5. It says, "And when the camp sets forward, Aaron shall come and his sons, and they shall take down the covering veil and cover, katakalypto, the Ark of Testimony with it." Obviously, when God says, "I want you to cover the Ark of the Covenant," the point is that he wants it to be hidden. It is not to be shown to all the people. This is something that only the priests get to see, and even then, only the high priest gets to see the Ark and the Holy of Holies, and even he only gets to see it one time a year. This is not something for all the common Israelites to see. The point of covering it is to make it invisible. And thus, if God says a woman should be katakalypto, using the exact same verb that Paul did, he obviously wants her to be completely invisible. That's the point of the veil. Which begs the question, if you were to take a tiny piece of cloth, a little ornamental doily, and you were to plop it on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, would that count as katakalypto? Would God count that as katakalypto? I think we all know the answer. That is not at all what God had in mind when he said the Ark is to be katakalypto. But what if we got a bigger cloth? What if we kind of draped it over kind of like the middle of it and just kind of fell down the side? Would that count as katakalypto? Of course not. That's still not meeting the definition. But what if we made it drape over the whole top of it, and we made it go down both sides of it, and we still just left like the face of it visible? Would that be katakalypto? No. And so now we're going to go over what God means when he says katakalypto. Now this word kata occurs hundreds and hundreds of times throughout the Old Testament and New Testament. And sometimes it's actually in the form kato instead of kata. That's simply the difference between a verb and an adverb. It's the same word. For instance, it occurs in Matthew 27 when Jesus dies, and it says, "And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." And that word for bottom is kato. It was torn from top to kato. So you see how kato actually is used. Jesus says, "You are from beneath," that's the word kato, "I am from above." So kato doesn't just mean coming down, it also means down, like all the way to the bottom. That is what Paul means. He doesn't just mean let it come down like 2 inches. He is talking about completely covering it. Does anybody doubt that when the scriptures say the veil of the temple was torn from top to kato, that it was completely torn down to the floor? And yet we will still be faced with the same objection every time from people who do not know Greek and they do not know church history, that Paul said to veil the head and not the face. They always say, well, Paul could have been more specific. He could have said the face instead of saying the head of the woman should be katakalypto. I hope you, viewer, are already realizing how ridiculous of an objection that is. And by the way, the distinction between the head and the face is not lost on the early church fathers. They are also aware of the difference between head and face, and yet all the church fathers who could speak Greek actually spoke Greek as their native language. They understood this language better than anybody, and yet even they understood if the head is katakalypto, the face is automatically covered too. Clement of Alexandria says, "It has also been commanded that the head should be veiled and the face covered, for it is a wicked thing for beauty to be a snare to men." Tertullian says the same thing. "Arabia's heathen females will be your judges, who cover not only the head, but the face also, so entirely that they are content with one eye free to enjoy rather half the light than to prostitute the entire face." So you can see, they see the distinction between head and face, and yet they believe God has commanded that the face should be covered. And in Hippolytus's canons, it says in Canon 17th, "Of a freeborn woman and her duties, and of midwives, and of the separation of men from women, of virgins, commands that they should cover their faces and their heads. So you can see they are aware of the distinction, and yet they still think the faces should be covered. Let's hear the Church Fathers explicitly address this argument. Here is Ambrose of Milan, who could speak both Latin and Greek. He says, "Let custom itself teach us. A woman covers her face with a veil for this reason, that in public her modesty may be safe. But if she cover her head with a veil, that she may not accidentally see or be seen, for when the head is veiled, the face is hidden, how much more ought she to cover herself with the veil of modesty, so as even in public to have her own secret place?" Do you hear Ambrose explicitly telling you that when the head is veiled, the face is hidden? That's because it is katakalypto. It's not just calypto, it's katakalypto, from top to bottom. John Chrysostom gives a similarly perfect definition for this word. Paul said not merely covered, that's the word calypto, but covered over, that's the word katakalypto, meaning that she be carefully wrapped up on every side. Paul didn't just say that women should be calyptoed, they should be katakalypto, meaning that they be carefully wrapped up on every side of their head. Every side. The whole head wrapped up all the way around. That is the definition of katakalypto. So even if we concede the claim that head refers to the scalp, that still necessitates that the cloth hang from the top all the way down over the sides. The veil starts at the top, but it doesn't end at the top. It starts at the top of the head and ends at her feet. There are some women who have heard about this command for women to veil themselves, but they aren't completely down with the idea. Their version of a veil doesn't actually come all the way down. It stays on top. It's not katakalypto. It's not even calypto. It's just pancake. And it's not that we have anything against pancakes. Pancakes are delicious. Our point is that God never told you to wear a pancake on your head. There's nothing pious about it. It's not especially religious. It's a man-made concept that God wants to see some tiny cloth plopped on your head for symbolic reasons. That small piece of cloth does not meet the definition of katakalypto. It must start at the top and extend all the way down, hiding the entire person for it to meet God's requirement.